Thank you again for joining us in the Educating the Billions mini-series. Once again, I have David and Mark here to discuss some of their experiences. Let's start with you, Mark. In this episode, I want to focus on the question of, well, schools and higher education usually have a contractual relationship with an intermediary, but how often, how should they consider the investor's relationship in this scheme?
So I think education is a very restricted area, and so unlike other areas, people don't set up their own wholly foreign-owned school. Very rare to have a joint venture. So in most cases, if we're looking at a UK school, there's a licensing and an operational agreement with what you call is the intermediary. It doesn't always have to be. It can be the intermediary and the investor of the same group, but it would probably be the most common single structure is, so you have the UK school, they have a contract with an intermediary. Normally the issues to consider would be something like exclusivity, but then the intermediary would have a few provinces or maybe all of China, and then the intermediary would go out and find for different local prospective schools, local investors, and the local investor would take typically the term sheet, show it to the local government, get a plot of land, build the school. And I think something which you see more increasingly, which is happening, is because very often the intermediaries are not cash rich. So the local investor may well be an investor also in the intermediary, so not just the school. And so I think that can lead to conflicts between the different parties. And I think for the schools, the intermediary often say, it doesn't matter who our local partner is. It doesn't really matter. You don't need to know. But I think the schools need to do some due diligence, based on a reputational reason. Also, just to feel comfortable that the project is able to have the financial resources, to actually be fulfilled. And thirdly, you want to have some veto rights so that you can keep control over things. But it's something which is relatively difficult to deal with. But I'd be interested to know what David thinks, because he's worked in these schools. What kind of tensions there are between the different parties.
Yeah, thanks. But I think I would definitely advise the UK school to be clear on who they're partnering with, because as you so rightly say, there are always three people in a new school relationship. There's the franchise, which is the British school that's looking to be represented and to take a revenue in return for their name and for their intellectual property, which could be the distinctive of their school or their curriculum, whatever it might be. So there's the British school. There's the intermediary, which is the agency in China that will be setting up the school and actually running it. Some of the big groups have their own international centers based either in China or somewhere in Asia to run their schools across the network. And they're the intermediary that run the actual entity of the school, the legal entity of the school. And then there's the individual investor who, probably in conjunction with local government or local landowners, they buy the land, they build the school, and then they provide it in return for a rental agreement to the intermediary to run the school. Now, as Mark so rightly says, because quite a number of these intermediaries are not cash rich, they end up having to take money from outside investors in order to fund what is a really expensive job of setting up a school. Because it's not just, fitting it out, putting in the chemistry labs and, the lights in the theatre and the gym equipment and the sports equipment and so on. It's not just that. It's actually paying the salaries for the year before setup for the support staff that are necessary to do the donkey work, and the staff that you need to have in situ to do the recruiting of the teaching staff. Then you're paying probably first, second, third, maybe fourth, fifth, and even sixth or seventh, at least some percentage of salary, until the school starts breaking even and is able to pay the necessary salary bill. So when you put all that together, there's a shed load of cash that's necessary within the entity before actually you can recognize it as a viable concern. So what they often do is they take investment from the landowner, the school builder, the school landlord. So what you can end up with is a situation where the entity itself, the educational entity, is majority owned by the person who owns the school. So actually the entity becomes nothing more than, if you like, a hired hand, and has no real control if they've lost more than 51% of the control of that particular entity. And in that particular case, an unscrupulous landlord who, as I was mentioning earlier, was only interested in inflating the price of property to sell flats, can start squeezing money out of the school, not put so much into salaries, not allow extra headcount, not put such a significant equipment bill in, and the school quality will diminish, irrespective of how well it's run by the entity and by the head teacher and by the staff. And when that happens, that's a real risk to the franchise. And they therefore need to know at the beginning, on what basis will the entity be funded? And my advice would be try and get an independently funded entity which controls at least 51% of the entity. Obviously, they're going to be borrowing money from outside investors, but not so much that they lose control. If they lose control, then the school is really a bit of a lottery, and that's not a situation that the franchisee wants to be in.
Thanks a lot for that, David. Mark, it seems that there could be a lot of conflicting interests here between the different parties. What are some of the preemptive measures that the franchise, like David mentioned, or the schools, what steps can they take to ensure that they maintain some control over the project?
So, I mean, I think, contracts are important, and also strategic thinking at the start of the contract. So I think regardless of how well drafted a contract is, if it's an unsuccessful project, you're going to have a problem. So I think, the first issue is, do the due diligence on the partner, check the alignment, and it's going to be a little bit tough. It's tough to agree it, like have the veto rights over the local partner and vet them. They're tough to negotiate, but they're important to have. Have a right to take over the school, that you have to give a, handing over certificate, that the school maintains leverage over that process. I think it's very important. But regardless, even if we go back in time and we could rewrite contracts, the contract will never be the perfect solution. So I think, and that is mostly done through the exit clause, stopping unilaterally the brand. So make sure that you own your trademark in Chinese and English, and just have that as a bit of a plan. I don't think it will come to that in many cases, but if you don't have it, it makes it much more difficult. So think, instead of always, a lot of contracts seek to compel people in difficult situations to do things that they don't want to do. That's tough anywhere. It's even tougher in China if you're sitting in the UK. So I think it's more about, how can I be free to extricate myself from this project? So that would be the way. I think, firstly, put in measures to have veto rights over the local partners, be involved how the project continues, that you accept the school or you don't accept the school. And then finally, in the contract, be clear that you are able to unilaterally exit, rather than compel somebody to try to do something that you want to do.
One last question. It seems that the theme of this episode is balancing interest and making sure that you have representation in the project that's happening in China. How important do you think it is for headquarters to have representation in the form of a staff or headmaster to make sure that their interests are represented in the project?
Yeah, it's a big question, Sean, at the moment, as to the structure of governance and the structure of leadership of these new schools that have been opened up, British bilingual schools. I think, given the changing nature of regulation that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, that makes the regulatory authority coming through from the MOE through the local governments, the local Jiaweis, means that there's so much government input into these schools that you do need to have a Chinese leader. I'm increasingly of the view that the head, the principal, the president needs to be Chinese. And as you know, these are Chinese schools, so they need to have a Chinese legal entity anyway by law. that legal entity needs to have authority to be able to maneuver the school to align and comply with the law. I think probably 5-6 years ago, it would have been perfectly possible for an international head to be able to do that. But unless they're very conversant or have very close translation skills, they're going to be a little bit outmaneuvered. So I would say that the senior leadership should be Chinese, but very close to the senior leadership, either a co-principal or a deputy principal should be an expat, an international teacher who's conversant with the international curriculum. It's the IB, the A-level, the AP, whatever it might be that's been done in the high school, and the English language element of the curriculum. The curriculum in the compulsory phase, years 1 through 9, will be the Chinese national curriculum, but there will be extensions to it that need to be supported. So you do need an international deputy to shape that and to ensure that the teaching standards and approaches are correct. And that person should also be pretty clear what the value system and ambitions are of the home school from the UK. So it's very useful for there to be some form of induction that leader should spend time in the school in the UK. Many of these, the branded schools would have a week, 2 weeks, maybe even longer in the home school before the individual came out to China. And then there will be a structure of representation of the home school within the governing body. Now, the governors clearly are local, they're running the school where they are, but there could easily be representation of the mothership on that governing body. Some schools have been set up with actually the chair of governors being a senior leader within the school group in the UK. They come across for the governing meeting. That's difficult to do. I would say that's proven to not be perhaps the most successful way of doing it. Better to have a governing body or a directorship in situ, but there needs to be on that some representation of the mothership. And most of the franchise schools will send across a representative to do an annual inspection, some form of check to make sure that what's going on in the school is in alignment with the agreements that have been signed, but also represents the values and ethos of the school that they are putting their name to. So there's a number of checks and balances that will be built into the system to ensure that governance and leadership do balance the representational interests of the home school with the franchise school in the UK.
Mark, did you want to?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is in most of the school projects that we're working on, governance is an issue, but it's not normally that controversial, I don't think. I'm sure what David's saying is in the implementation, things become more complicated. But I think something which we use is normally like an international principle and the local principle, and like David called them co-principles. And interestingly enough, this kind of concept seems relatively alien to Chinese and Anglo-Saxon culture, because normally there's always one leader, but continental Europe is quite comfortable with having 2 general managers or something like that. So I think it's a relatively unique situation in China where we, will actually have the opportunity to have 2 people, being the co-leaders. As David mentioned, the international principal would have his ambit, and I think it's important. Just as an outsider, I think it's important that the international headmaster does have sovereignty, or however we would say that, of his area, or like hiring the staff for the international elements, and that the international curriculum, that he does not report to the Chinese principal. The Chinese principal doesn't report to him in the other operational issues. I think those 2 would have to work together, and that of course is difficult just to regulate by a contract. It will often depend on the type of persons involved in those roles. But that's how I think all of our schools have solved it, is this co-principal idea, because we also I think the schools cannot really allow somebody else just to be in charge of, like David said, even that international principal. It's not enough just to hire somebody who's been a principal somewhere. It has to be somebody who really understands your ethos, your DMA. Otherwise, how can he really represent you in China? So I think that's what we would see. So that's, I don't know if David.
No, I don't want to disagree with that, because I think in theory that's right. There is one other factor which I think is the changing marketplace. One of the side effects of a lot of PE money coming into the educational sector is that the price of a Chinese teacher is now much higher. You're seeing really good teachers can demand really quite high salaries. So salary bills, which used to be predicated on, an international teacher being twice the price of a Chinese teacher. So, you could probably go 50-50. 50% of the staff will be Chinese, 50% would be international. And that was the normal way that most of these early bilingual schools were set up, often with co-teaching models, particularly in the primary and the kindergarten. But now I think what we're seeing is that there's a drift towards the Chinese teachers being more expensive than that. It's also more difficult to get good quality international teachers in, and with COVID, they can't get into China anyway. So the model is probably going to drift more and more towards a sort of a 70-30, 70% Chinese, 30% expat. And on that basis, and on the one that I mentioned before, which is where you've got significantly more imposition coming from government, a Chinese leader being in charge makes a lot more sense. Because the majority of staff are Chinese, just about 100% of the kids are Chinese, the curriculum is Chinese, so it's a little bit of an imposition to suggest that the head should be an expat. I think the head should be, the international representation should be there as like a very good consultant, so as a deputy principal working alongside the Chinese head in order to move things forward. But it's an interesting one, and I've had many discussions, Mark, with clients about what model they would want to use. I think I'm advising Chinese head, international deputy principal, but I can see the co-principal model working.
But you could imagine. I mean, life will just. I mean, we have structures, and lawyers are the worst because you have a template contract, so that's always the default. And so I think very often people don't think creatively. But I think for your first school, that co-principal thing would make a lot of sense. But if you are successful and you have 6 schools, and if we imagine, the other thing which you didn't mention, even forget COVID, as the number of schools increase, the number of British headmasters doesn't increase. So it's a finite number with increasing demand. So would you also think it could well be that we would need to be flexible enough that, firstly, once you get to 6 schools, the Chinese partner has proven itself to be reliable, but it also understands better the school itself. And so maybe instead of having a co-principal at every school, we just need some super UK headmaster who is kind of like, regionally responsible for the school, and so could visit, and so that the Chinese could take more of a lead. I'm just thinking for the school in the first stage, if you're dealing with an untested partner, you might be worried about actually just being a consultant because your name is on the door.
Yeah, understood. I think the model you're describing is executive headship, where the head is the international head is overseeing the control of the broader entity. It is a very significant issue, trying to balance the different parts of the equation. But you're right, and that's where the international control tends to perhaps be better placed within the central system. So the entity itself will probably employ an expat director of schools. But even there, you see, I think what we're seeing is the localization of education in China, in the same way that back in 2010, the brand leader for mobile phones was the iPhone. Nowadays, 34% of the market goes to Huawei. You've got Xiaomi just behind, and Oppo and Vivo. There, you've got Chinese brands that have taken over the mobile phone market, and you're seeing the same thing happening in the schools market. The Ulinks and Guanhuas and Bright Scholars, Country Gardens of this world are leading the way. And although they will use expat leadership, they're essentially Chinese schools. I think there's the place of the international teacher within that is exactly the same thing as what's happening within many multinationals in China. There was a massive move towards localization, but now we're pulling back a little bit and saying we do need to have strategically placed internationals in order to preserve quality and a different structure of leadership. And I think the same thing will happen within schools. So sometimes it will be the head, sometimes the deputy, sometimes an executive head, sometimes a director of school, but there needs to be that influence coming through the door. My point about the head being Chinese is that there's just so much stuff coming through. My last headship in China had 28 inspections in 1 year, and they're all done by Chinese entities. And so you just simply don't have control of that if you're not a Chinese speaker. It's much easier to leave that with the Chinese head that can get all that done. But it all comes down
I guess
to...
it is possible that they were just investigating you as a high-risk headmaster.
Yeah, I was rumbled. But yeah, but I do think that as the thing matures, there's going to be more Chinese leadership in the system.
But I think a lot of people, we don't really think creatively about the situation. So, typically the school projects that we've been working on, it's with an intermediary that has some educational people, but they're not like a country garden. And I think the thing is for sure that those groups that you mentioned, Keystone, those kind of guys, they will be the big players in China. And if you could be one of their brands, it might be a very comfortable place to be. And there you probably would be more consultant. But, if you're dealing with a Chinese partner, and you're not even sure if he's gone to school, you might need to have somebody a bit more hands-on, if you've got your reputation at stake, query whether you would do it, but, people do things. So that's all I'm saying is it really depends on the situation, but I wouldn't, hand over the governance to the Chinese partner until they've earned your trust that they know how to do things. Obviously, those big education groups, they're successful. There'll be other conflicts with them, but they would at least know how to run and fund the school, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the big groups, some do have Chinese leadership, some have expat leadership, some have co-principals. There's a lot of different models out there. And I think, again, some work, some don't work. And it's not because of structure, it's to do with the relationship between the
people, the individuals. Yeah.
It's the same as any organization. If you've got good relationships, you can make any structure work. But yeah, I agree. I think you've identified the issue.
Thank you so much for that. I thought it was very interesting. I think it's very apparent that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and the key is to remain flexible. So if any of you watching have questions about how your situation might fit into this conversation, the email addresses for David and Mark are on the screen. Please feel free to contact them directly, and stick around for the next episode. Thank you so much for watching.